Welcome back to How to Craft Fair. This is episode 5 in the How to Become a Craft Fair Organizer series. If you want to check out other episodes in this series so far, click on this tab up here and it'll take you to the entire playlist. But today we're going to be talking about selecting the event size. So we've already touched on a few different elements that kind of leads up to this decision, but now I'm going to show you a bunch of different factors to consider when setting the size for your show. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so one of the things I'm going to do during each of these videos in this series is to think of things from the vendor's point of view. The reason why I want to try to instill this thought process in you as an organizer is because it's going to help you to attract not only a larger pool of vendors, but also probably higher quality vendors as well. So the first thing that I want to talk about here in this particular video is what do vendors prefer as far as the size of shows that they sign up for. So I sent out a survey to vendors, and one of the questions that I asked them was, what size of events do you prefer to participate in? There was 3 different ranges. So small events were considered to be 25 booths or fewer, medium booths were 26 to 74 booths, and then large events were just considered 75 booths or more. Only 8% of vendors said that they prefer small events of 25 booths or fewer. However, just want to make a little bit of a sidebar here and say that if this is your very first craft fair that you're ever planning, this might be the route that you want to go, just to kind of get familiar with the process and to make it a little bit less overwhelming your first time, because regardless of all the advice you get and everything, you're still going to have nerves and be a little bit shaky that first time until, you go through that whole cycle at least once. So what did the vendors say? 62% of vendors said that they prefer the mid-size shows. Now, again, that was between 26 and 74 booths. Okay. So it's definitely a graduation over that entry-level smaller show, but it's not so overwhelming that it becomes a staggering amount of vendors that you have to communicate with for, possibly upwards of a year leading up to the show. Okay, so you have to keep that in mind too. It's not just the day of the event. It's not just, all the work that you have to do the day of the show. You're going to be communicating with all of your vendors all the way up to the event from the time that they register with you and even apply with you. Okay, so keep that in mind. That's a big part of this process. That, to be honest, is probably a bulk of your work, is just communication with the vendors. Okay, so the day of the event actually represents a very small piece of the pie. To touch on the final part of the question, 30% of vendors said that they prefer large scale events, which again, I consider to be shows that feature at least 75 booths. These tend to be premier events that offer multiple entertainment options for visitors. Basically, at this point, typically you're not just talking about the craft fair. There could be food trucks in addition to the vendors, live music, a bar, possibly even live crafting workshops, a raffle or a silent auction, or other forms of entertainment. So these are the elements that start to get introduced typically with these bigger shows that are 75 booths or more. You do see some of these things mixed into typically like your medium size events, but when you get to that smaller stage of fewer than 25 booths, then it's more so just about, the vendors, the booths, and things like that. There's definitely not an expectation to have all of these other entertainment options at a smaller show. Okay, now that we've talked about things from the vendor's perspective, I want to start to give you some tips that really gets you thinking in your shoes as an organizer. Okay, so one of the things that I want to talk about is just the venue itself. So sometimes you have maybe like a particular venue in mind, and that will in itself dictate how many vendors and how many booths and even how many attendees can comfortably participate and visit the event. So you need to consider all the available space that you can map out for booths, walkways, so the aisles for the visitors, and any additional features that you might have at the event. So even something as simple as just seating areas for people who are at the show, but they want to take like a few minutes to rest or just, kind of take in the scene for a little bit. These are all different spaces that are going to eat up square footage in your venue, in your layout. So the venue that you select, it's not just going to be about the booths. Okay, so you have to think about everything else and every other element. Think about when you go to a craft fair as a visitor, just as a shopper. Think about, what makes you comfortable at a craft fair. Maybe some things are, a little bit more spread out where there's a little bit more like breathability and like walkability. And on the flip side, what can be a little bit of a drawback? Maybe things are too closed in, they're too tight. Think about even just the way the building is situated. Is it like a nice shape, or are things narrow and kind of constricted and confined? Sometimes you see events at, for example, high schools. Okay, so a lot of times high schools would do craft fairs and they'll have vendors kind of set up in the hallway where, normally the students in the lockers would be. This on paper seems like it's enough room, but sometimes if the event gets kind of popular, which, it's never a bad thing, but if it starts to get where there's a lot of attendees and a lot of visitors, it can feel really, really cramped and it's almost like too much, So you want to pick a venue that is appropriate for the size of craft fair that you want to host. So everything that I just summarized in this section, think of this as a decision with space in mind. You're thinking about space. Now, another way to approach this is vendor participation. So perhaps you're not really thinking about, okay, I want this much space and I want to have room for this thing and that thing and this entertainment feature or whatever. Maybe you have like a certain number of vendors in mind. So maybe you're like, okay, I want to communicate with like 50 vendors and, I want to be able to get my registration process completed rather quickly, like your signups and all the vendors applying for the show and confirming their participation in your event. Maybe you only want to deal with, 40 or 50 individual vendors. So that's kind of approaching this from a different angle. Whereas before we talked about making the decision with space in mind, square footage in mind. Maybe you want to make the decision with people in mind. Like, okay, if I get to like 75 vendors, that's really overwhelming for me and I want to keep it to like 50. Perhaps that determines the type of venue that you want to book, because then you can start to map out your layout based on the number of vendors that you want to place a cap on for your show. Okay, so there's two different like thought processes of like how big you want to go with your show. You can do it based on square footage and the number of booths, or, basically just do it with the number of people that I want to be communicating with for this particular event. Now, there is another way to think about this and approach this decision on, how big to take your craft fair. And perhaps you want to hit a certain attendance milestone. Okay, so let's just say, for example, a round number, you want to have 1,000 people come to your craft fair. This can also help to kind of paint a picture on what kind of a space you need and what kind of a building you should be in. And it is a lot harder to predict. Okay, so we talked about just general square footage before. We also talked about the number of vendors before. This one, it's a little bit trickier because your attendance is never guaranteed, especially at an outdoor show where you are exposed to the elements. But this can be another layer in this decision. So say, for example, you're planning a new craft fair that you've never hosted before, and it's kind of like an inaugural, first annual inaugural type of situation. Well, maybe you want to kind of set your roots down and you want this show to be an established event that repeats either annually or seasonally, something like that. Well, the first time you host an event is likely going to be when your attendance is not that great. People aren't aware of the event yet. Yes, you're going to do plenty of advertising, and I will show you how to do that, but you just don't have that like cult following yet for your show. You don't have that established repetitive presence in the community. So your attendance is likely going to go up as time goes on, the more times you make an appearance at this venue. So are you going to outgrow it? Are you basically setting yourself up where it's kind of tight from the very beginning, and then then what? You have to move locations, or you're kind of capped at a certain number that you wish could be higher? So take that into consideration as well. Think about, your potential attendee figure and how many shoppers you'd like to attract to the show, not just year one, but try to think about it long term as well. So now let's just talk about, rolling up the sleeves and actually putting some work in. So we're going to talk about budget and resources, and there's a couple of different things to touch on here, but you want to consider the financial and human resources available for organizing this fair. So a larger event may require more financial investment, not only up front, but probably along the way as well, because basically, we talked about the different event sizes before, the 25 booths to like 75 and up. Well, you're probably going to invest more into an event if there's like 120 booths as opposed to there being 20, right? I mean, it's just natural. It's bigger. You kind of put more into it, just even from a financial perspective. Now, when you consider things from, again, like a human resources perspective, the bigger you go, you're going to be in the thick of it a lot more. Okay. And you're going to need help outside of yourself. So when we organized shows, it was the three of us. It was my wife and my sister. And even with the three of us being in it full time, it's not like it was like, some kind of little side gig or anything like that. I mean, this is what we like lived off of doing. It took all we had for some of our bigger shows. Like our biggest show was 230 booths, and it was the hardest work I've like ever done. I mean, so it really can become like exponential as far as the requirements and just the demand that is going to be on you to make the show a success, and even just to put it on, let alone for it to be a successful event. Okay. So just kind of take growth with a little bit of caution and grow in a healthy manner. Okay. Kind of take it step by step and be progressive with it rather than taking this massive leap and biting off more than you can chew. Okay. So there is a healthy way to do it, and just take it little by little, and it'll pay off for you in the long run. But again, consider those things. Are you organizing this event completely by yourself? Will you have volunteers to help? Will, friends and family be able to help? And try not to put all your eggs in that basket, okay? Because that can be kind of dangerous where, maybe it's your, I don't want to say hobby. It could be your hobby to do this, or it could be literally your livelihood as it was for us. Okay. So it could be a really, really serious and big thing in your life to do this event, and your helpers, maybe it's not as big of a deal for them. Okay. So try to get reliable help if you're going to have it. Okay. So that's a really, really important thing too. But again, just factor in how much help you're going to have leading up to the show, and then that can help you determine the size. Also, from a financial perspective, because we did talk about the budget, how much cash flow do you have leading up to the show? Because the venue is going to require a down payment. Pretty much all venues, this is standard now. Typically what you'll see is like half down and then half at a later date, still before the event. Sometimes there's even fees after the show too. So for example, if you have an admission fee at the door and people have to pay for entrance into your event, Sometimes the venue will take a cut of those admission fees, or they'll basically charge you for parking or electricity. There can be all these little costs associated in. So this is something I mentioned before in this series, but it is worth noting again. You have to be absolutely sure that you have all of the financials up front so you know what you're getting yourself into. So don't sign any contracts until everything is laid out black and white, crystal clear, and something that you can be comfortable with. Okay, so try to factor in what your booth fees are going to be. That's something that you're going to have to do basically as you're booking the event, because that's going to determine whether this is even financially feasible for you. So when we start thinking about budget, it is kind of a can of worms. There's so many different things to consider, not only just the money up front for the venue, but then you also have to factor in everything leading up to the show. So all of your marketing, supplies, and everything that's going to roll into that budget. So that again is another layer in this onion to consider of what type of venue to book and what size the show should be. How much can you actually afford to do? Okay, now another element I want to touch on a little bit more in some greater detail is the activities and attractions and the kind of special entertainment factor of the show. So again, it's really easy to map out an event and just say that, okay, there's going to be a booth here, booth here, booth here, map out all your booths. But when you start to factor in, say, live entertainment like a musician, or maybe there's a food truck, that is going to require more room than you might think if you've never done this before. Okay, so it's not just about, let's say, for example, there's going to be a food truck. Okay, so you can't just factor in the size of the truck and then maybe like a little space. People are going to want to basically kind of congregate in that area and just hang out in that area. When people order food, they want a place to sit down and kind of just take it easy for a while they eat their food. There also has to be room for a line that's going to form. So throughout the day, there's going to be little busy periods where there's going to be a line. And also, for live entertainment, like a musician, if you have, an acoustic guitar player or something like that, well, there might be some seating around there, or even people just kind of standing around and watching. So just be sure that when you're selecting a venue and you're trying to decide on how big you want your show to be, that this is a space that's going to take up a lot of space. Okay, so these extra elements, they are going to, you need a lot of room for these. Same thing with the craft workshops. When there's some sort of demonstration, maybe you bring somebody in that does, I don't know, bouquets of flowers, and they show people how to assemble bouquets. That all requires a lot of room. So just be sure that you're dedicating some appropriate size to those extra things so that the whole space can be comfortable and it doesn't turn into like a bottleneck of congestion. On the flip side too, you also want to make sure that they're not so far removed from the event that they feel isolated and basically separated from all the action. When you bring in these, let's call them entertainment options, entertainers, whatever you want to refer to them as, they want to be part of it. And you need to basically find a balance between giving them room, but also making them feel like they are part of the event, and then they are kind of like right in the center of the action as well. So there definitely is like a delicate balance to this, but it's something that is going to be different with every venue. And I mean, every venue is laid out differently, and you'll have to find these pockets where you can make them feel comfortable, not isolated, but also not a really, really nasty congested area either. All right, so now I wanted to touch on some final points and give you some just general tips as an organizer. Now, one of the most important things that you're going to do is to get as many people through the door as possible to check out all the vendors' creative works. Okay, so that's going to be one of your most important tasks as an organizer. Get as many shoppers as you can. But you want to make sure that you've selected a venue that's ready to handle that kind of crowd. Okay, so again, the trickiest time that you're going to be worried about all this is the first time that you host a show at a new venue. So don't don't feel bad if you feel really nervous about it or you've got jitters, leading up to the event, making sure that you did the layout correctly and, hoping that your entire marketing strategy is effective and that the people show up. That's normal. Every organizer feels that the first time, before there's any kind of like established track record to go off of. So we're going to talk about marketing strategies later, but again, I can't emphasize this enough that you want to try to attract as many shoppers as possible, but the venue has to be able to accommodate this kind of a load. So not just within the facility, but what is the parking situation like? Is it on a main street or is it like just completely isolated, off in the middle of nowhere where nobody's going to be able to find it? These are all things that you need to factor in when selecting a venue and the size of the venue. Now, again, if you're organizing your very first craft fair ever, I would recommend starting small and then you can kind of work your way up to larger events, but I would resist the urge to start big. Okay. So even if you want to get there at some point, hey, that's awesome. I mean, I love, the motivation that I see in a lot of even the vendors that comment on this channel. And I've seen organizers comment on this channel, like they're really fired up and ready to go. That is amazing. That's what you love to see, but you kind of have to like keep yourself in check and make sure that you're, again, growing in a healthy manner. Okay. Because it's just going to, first of all, keep you so much more motivated. So if you absolutely crush it and you do really well at a smaller event, that's going to have you feeling way better as opposed to if you try to start off with a big show and it's kind of a flop. That's really going to have you feeling really dicey going into that second show, rather than if you started small, you're going to be feeling great and you're going to be ready to take on a little bit more. Okay. So that's something to kind of consider as well. So I hope that you take these factors into consideration when you're selecting the size for your show. Very excited to talk about the future episodes, what's to come in the series. I know this is so much kind of like of the, I don't want to say the boring prep work beforehand, but it really is. We haven't really gotten into the nitty gritty yet, but it is coming. But these are things that we have to talk about. Sometimes as an event organizer, some things are, not as exciting as others, but stay tuned. If you want to check out all the other videos in the playlist, click on this playlist above. And thank you all so much for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Have yourself a great day.